I want to talk about something that a lot of you have been asking me about in the comments, and honestly, it's something I've been thinking about myself almost every single day this year. What is happening to this planet right now? We have had earthquake after earthquake after earthquake, one massive event after another, and the destruction, the loss of life, the scale of it all, it genuinely feels like something has shifted. Japan, then the Philippines with a devastating 7, 8, Mexico, Colombia, and now most recently, a catastrophic 7. 7 in Indonesia again, this time in the Flores region, with buildings collapsing, landslides cutting entire communities off from the outside world, and this strange, unusual swarm of aftershocks that just will not stop. More aftershocks in 2 days after that quake than we saw after the 9. 2 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, and more than after Kamchatka. That alone should tell you something strange is going on beneath our feet. So let's actually talk about this properly, because I think this deserves more than just a quick reaction video. Let's talk about the global tsunami warnings that have gone out again and again this year. Let's talk about the thousands of people who have lost their lives. Let's talk about the images we keep seeing of people running into the streets in the middle of the night because another enormous earthquake has just appeared somewhere on the map. And I want to be clear here because this distinction matters a lot. We are not talking about magnitude 4 earthquakes. We are not talking about magnitude 5 earthquakes. These are major earthquakes, magnitude 7. And above, several of them creeping up close to magnitude 8. As of right now, in 2026, we have had 11 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or larger around the world, and in most of these cases, the consequences have been absolutely catastrophic. On top of that, we have also seen 34 earthquakes between magnitude 6 and 6. 9, which we shouldn't just brush aside either, even though they don't tend to make the same headlines. So when you step back and look at this year, at the death tolls, at the collapsed buildings, at the tsunami sirens going off over and over again, it is scary. It is genuinely unsettling. And I think there's an obvious question hiding underneath all of this, a question I've seen asked over and over in the comments on my channel. Is something changing? Has something shifted beneath the surface of this planet? Are the tectonic plates becoming more active than they used to be? Are these earthquakes somehow connected to each other, like some kind of chain reaction bouncing across the globe, a ping-pong effect moving from one fault line to another? Are we watching some kind of global escalation happen in real time? And I'll tell you honestly right now, before we even get into the details, I believe we are going to see more of this before the year is over. If 11 earthquakes isn't statistically extraordinary on its own, what about the timing? Look at how close together some of I'll explain exactly why I believe that as we go. But first, I want to ask a slightly different question, because I think it's actually the more important one. Are these massive earthquakes connected to each other in some mechanical way? Or does 2026 simply feel extraordinary because several of the earthquakes this year happen to be so incredibly destructive? Because those are two very different explanations, and they lead to two very different conclusions about what is actually happening to our planet right now. I went through the numbers myself, earthquake by earthquake, month by month, when I found something. There is one comparison in particular that I think completely changes the way we need to look at this entire year. But before I get to that, let's walk through how we actually got here, because the sequence itself tells a story. The first magnitude 7 earthquake of 2026 happened back in February. February 22nd, a magnitude 7. One near Kota Belud in Malaysia. Now this one was extraordinary, but for a completely different reason than the ones that would follow later in the year. This earthquake happened at a depth of about 629 kilometers, which is roughly 391 miles beneath the surface of the Earth. That is an extremely deep earthquake. Extremely deep. If you've been following my channel for a while, you know how rare and unusual that kind of depth actually is. Hold on to that one, because later it's going to help explain something very important about why two earthquakes with almost identical magnitudes can produce completely different outcomes for the people living above them. After Malaysia, we had a bit of a gap, and then on March 24th, a magnitude 7, 5, some reports rounding it to 7. 6 struck near Tonga. Another enormous earthquake, this one at a depth of roughly 234 kilometers. Or about 145 miles. Then, just 6 days later, on March 30th, a magnitude 7. 3 hit near Vanuatu. At this point, the global earthquake map basically looked like it was lighting up one region after another. And then, only 2 days after that, on April 1st, no joke intended given the date, a magnitude 7. 4 struck Indonesia, east-southeast of Batangbung. Think about that sequence for a second. A 7, 5, then a 7, 3, then a 7, 4, 3 separate magnitude 7 plus earthquakes within a little more than a week. If you were watching the global seismic activity maps during that stretch, it already looked remarkable. And it wasn't even finished yet. On April 20th, a magnitude 7. 4 struck offshore near Miyako, Japan. After that, there was a bit of a pause in major earthquake activity, a quieter stretch that lasted until June, and that's really where this year became something that was much, much harder to ignore when it comes to earthquakes. On June 7th, a fatal magnitude 7, 8 struck southwest of Cotabato on Mindanao in the Philippines. At the time, this became the largest earthquake of 2026, but it didn't hold that title for long, because on June 24th, Venezuela was hit first by a magnitude 7. 2, and before the shaking from that quake had even fully ended, just 39 seconds later, a magnitude 7. 5 struck. Not hours later, not the following day, 39 seconds. The USGS actually describes that first 7, 2 as a foreshock to the larger 7. 5 that followed it almost immediately, which on its own is a remarkable and honestly frightening thing to witness in real time. The consequences in Venezuela were catastrophic, and they still are, because we are looking at more than 6,000 people believed lost. And unfortunately, that number has continued to climb. So now try to imagine what this looks like to someone who has been following global earthquake activity all year. Because I know a lot of you have, right alongside me. 3 major earthquakes packed together at the end of March and the beginning of April, then Japan in April. Then the 7. 8 in the Philippines in June, then the double disaster in Venezuela. And less than a month after that, on July 17th, off the coast of southern Mexico, a magnitude 7. 3 struck. This one was shallow, only about 19 kilometers or 12 miles deep. Then, as crazy as it sounds, on August 10th, near Bahia Solano in Colombia, a magnitude 7. 4 hit, with an epicenter only about 5 kilometers, roughly 3 miles, from the densely populated town of San Jose de Palmar. That earthquake itself was actually fairly deep, roughly 110 kilometers, about 68 miles down. And yet, even at that depth, the destruction was enormous. At least 300 people were reported lost. And then, just days later, came the Flores earthquake in eastern Indonesia, a very shallow magnitude 7. 7 that brought buildings and homes down and left the region dealing with an aftershock sequence that has genuinely been strange, because there have been so many aftershocks, and some of them have been large in their own right. Landslides blocked roads. Communications were disrupted across entire communities. A tsunami warning sent people running toward higher ground. And unfortunately this time, the tsunami was real, with waves reported between roughly 12 and 16 feet, close to 5 meters in some areas. By August 18th, at least 53 people had been reported lost, and around 5,000 people had been evacuated from the affected coastline. With that earthquake, the yearly total reached 11 earthquakes above magnitude 7. So when you line all of these up together, Venezuela, Colombia, the Philippines, Indonesia, I completely understand why so many of you are asking whether this can still be considered normal, especially when you look at the images coming out of Venezuela. 11 earthquakes above magnitude 7 sounds like an enormous number when you say it out loud. But here's where this takes a strange turn, and I want to walk you through exactly why. I went back 1 year to 2025 because I think context matters enormously here. We all remember the Kamchatka earthquake, magnitude 8. 8, an absolutely staggering event. So how many earthquakes of magnitude 7 or larger did we actually have in all of 2025? You might not remember the exact number because not all of them were as visually dramatic or as catastrophic in terms of human loss. The number, and I want you to really sit with this for a second, was 16. 16. There were 15 earthquakes between magnitude 7 and 7. 9 plus that one extraordinary magnitude 8. 8 event in Kamchatka, Russia. So 2025 gave us 16 major earthquakes across the entire year. Now think about where we are right now in 2026. We are heading into the end of August with September, October, November, and December still ahead of us. 4 months left in the year. So when you put our current number, 11, in that context, it changes the picture quite a bit. And according to the United States Geological Survey, over the long term, the Earth produces approximately 16 major earthquakes per year on average, roughly 15 in the magnitude 7 range, and approximately 1 magnitude 8 or greater, which means statistically we could still see 5 more magnitude 7 plus earthquakes before the year ends, and unfortunately, we could still see a magnitude 8 or higher. I really hope we don't. I genuinely hope we don't. But there's an even better way to put this year in perspective than just comparing it to a full 12-month average. Because we're currently sitting in August, comparing our count of 11 to a complete 12-month average of 16 isn't really the fairest comparison. The better question is, how many major earthquakes should we statistically expect to have seen by this exact point in the year, if this year were behaving like a completely normal average year? I came across a calculation done by an earthquake seismologist with Natural Resources Canada named John Cassidy, who worked this out for an article addressing exactly this question. According to his calculation, the expected number of major earthquakes we should have seen by this point in the year, based on historical averages, is roughly 12. The actual number we've recorded so far this year is 11. In other words, if you're looking purely at the raw number of significant major earthquakes that have occurred globally, 2026 is not running dramatically above average. It is actually remarkably close to what you would expect in a completely normal year. And that, honestly, creates a much more interesting mystery than the one we started with, because if the number of these giant earthquakes isn't actually unusually high, why does 2026 feel so extreme? Why does it feel like the planet itself has turned against us this year? Because it does feel that way, and the images we've all seen are genuinely extreme. The answer, I think, is hiding inside those very first earthquakes I described earlier. Remember Malaysia, magnitude 7.1, an enormous earthquake by any measure, but incredibly, incredibly deep, roughly 629 kilometers beneath the surface. Now compare that to the magnitude 7.3 off the coast of Mexico, which was only around 19 kilometers deep. That difference matters enormously, more than most people realize. The farther seismic waves have to travel upward to reach the surface, the more that energy naturally diminishes along the way. So you simply don't feel a very deep earthquake nearly as intensely on the surface as you would a shallow one of the same magnitude. A deep magnitude 7 can produce a completely different experience for the people living above it compared to a shallow magnitude 7 that ruptures directly beneath, or right next to, a densely populated city. But depth is only part of the story. Location matters just as much. How close is the earthquake to where people actually live? How many people are exposed to the strongest shaking? What kind of ground is sitting underneath them, because soft or loose soil can amplify shaking dramatically compared to solid bedrock? And perhaps most importantly of all, what are the buildings actually made of? Which regions got hit this year? And what kind of construction do those regions rely on? This was actually one of the central points raised by an earth sciences professor at Western University, Robert Sherbakov, who wrote about exactly this issue. He explains that a shallow earthquake generally has a much greater potential to produce intense ground shaking near its epicenter. We already understand that intuitively, but whether that shaking actually turns into a catastrophe depends enormously on what kind of structures are sitting on top of that ground when it happens. Take Japan as an obvious point of comparison. Modern Japanese buildings are constructed under extremely demanding seismic engineering standards, some of the strictest in the entire world, and even a lot of older structures across the country have already been retrofitted to meet modern safety codes. Now, take a very similar amount of ground shaking and instead put it underneath a region filled with older masonry, poorly reinforced concrete, or informal construction that never accounted for serious seismic loads, and the human outcome can be radically, tragically different. And unfortunately, that has been exactly the case this year in several of these disasters. And that may be the real underlying reason why 2026 feels so relentless. Not because the Earth is necessarily producing an extraordinary number of major earthquakes this year, but because, unluckily, several of these big earthquakes have struck close to, or directly underneath, major, densely populated centers filled with vulnerable communities and buildings that were never built to withstand this kind of shaking. That, according to the scientists looking closely at this year's data, is genuinely the unusual feature of 2026. The raw numbers themselves are not exceptional, but the human impact absolutely is. Now, there's still one more question I want to address directly, because I know a lot of you are thinking about it. If 11 earthquakes isn't statistically extraordinary on its own, what about the timing? Look at how close together some of these events happened. 3 giant earthquakes in quick succession earlier in the year, then the Philippines, then 2 enormous earthquakes in Venezuela back-to-back, then Mexico, then Colombia, then Indonesia again. Could one enormous earthquake somehow be triggering another one somewhere else on the planet? There's so much activity around the Pacific Ring of Fire, specifically. Is there some kind of domino effect rippling through the tectonic plates, one event setting off the next in a chain reaction that spans oceans? I understand why this idea is so tempting, honestly, because in a very real sense, all of Earth's tectonic plates are ultimately part of one connected planet, and that constant tectonic movement is actually part of why life exists on Earth in the first place. I've made an entire video on that topic before, by the way, and interestingly, not many of you watched that one, which I still don't fully understand because I think it's fascinating. But here's the thing. Just because the plates are all part of one connected system doesn't mean that every large earthquake is mechanically triggering the next large earthquake happening thousands of miles away. The basic driver behind all of these earthquakes is a process that moves incredibly slowly. Tectonic plates are constantly in motion, essentially drifting, at a typical rate of roughly 5 to 7 centimeters per year, somewhere around 2 to 3 inches. That doesn't sound like much at all, does it? It's roughly the same speed at which your fingernails grow. But let that process continue, uninterrupted, for an entire century and let that stress and energy keep building the whole time, and 2 or 3 inches per year eventually becomes several feet, sometimes several meters, of accumulated pent-up motion that can remain locked in place along a fault, while the surrounding plate keeps moving. That's the genuinely dangerous part of this whole process. Stress just keeps accumulating year after year, decade after decade, until eventually the fault simply cannot hold it back any longer, and it ruptures, releasing all of that built-up energy at once. This process is happening completely independently along active plate boundaries all over the planet, independently in Indonesia, in Japan, in Tonga, in Vanuatu, in the Philippines, in Mexico, and across South America. All of these regions sit within enormous active tectonic systems, each behaving according to its own local buildup of stress. And sometimes, simply by chance, major earthquakes will occur unusually close together in time, purely because that's how probability works when you have this many active fault systems running simultaneously across the globe. They just do occasionally cluster, and our brains, unfortunately, are extremely good at spotting that kind of cluster and immediately assuming there must be a hidden pattern behind it. It's a very human instinct, honestly, to look at a run of dramatic events and think there has to be something connecting all of this. But there's another number that I think helps put all of this into much clearer perspective. Worldwide, roughly 20,000 earthquakes are recorded and located by seismologists every single year. That works out to something like 55 earthquakes happening somewhere on this planet every single day. Most of them are small. Most never make international news. Most never produce the kind of horrifying images and videos that we've all been seeing this year. And that fact is genuinely important because we don't experience earthquakes as raw statistics. We experience them through images. A building folding in on itself, like we saw in Venezuela. Towers collapsing floor by floor. Roads splitting apart down the middle. A tsunami warning flashing across someone's phone in the middle of the night. Rescue workers digging through rubble with their bare hands. Entire neighborhoods reduced to broken concrete. When we see enough of these images packed together in a short period of time, and unfortunately we have this year, it starts to feel as though the planet itself has fundamentally changed. As though something has shifted beneath us. That feeling is completely real, and I don't want to dismiss it because the grief and the fear behind it are absolutely valid, but that feeling isn't the same thing as actual evidence that the underlying global earthquake rate has changed. So let's finally circle back and answer the question I started with. Is the Earth suddenly producing an abnormal number of massive earthquakes this year? Based on the data we actually have right now, the honest answer is no. 11 magnitude 7 plus earthquakes by this point in 2026 is frightening. There's no question about that. But the statistically expected number by this point in the year is roughly 12, and 2025, for comparison, finished the year with 16. So there is very likely more still to come before December. There's absolutely more to come. So if you start seeing headlines claiming some kind of global doomsday scenario or breathless predictions about the next big earthquake, I want you to think about the numbers we just walked through. We still have 4 months left in this year, and statistically speaking, we could see as many as 5 more major earthquakes in that window. So yes, in a sense, I am predicting that another big one is coming, because I understand how the averages work, not because I have some special insight into exactly when or where. And when it eventually happens, I guarantee some people will say, she knew it, she predicted it. But honestly, I just look at the historical statistics, because I think numbers matter more than fear in situations like this. So let's not turn this into a doomsday narrative. Based on the long-term averages, over the remaining 4 months of the year, we could reasonably expect at least a few more major earthquakes. But I also don't want to wave away what genuinely does feel unusual about this year, and how unusual it has felt, because of exactly where several of these earthquakes have struck. They have landed close to, or directly beneath, densely populated communities, filled with vulnerable infrastructure and buildings that were never designed to withstand this level of shaking. And that combination is what has turned a series of otherwise fairly normal geological events into absolutely enormous human tragedies. In many of these regions, scientists have actually been warning for years, sometimes for decades, that a major earthquake was inevitable, that it was only a matter of time. They urged governments to update building codes, to reinforce vulnerable structures, to prepare emergency response systems. But in a lot of these countries, doing that work was politically difficult, or economically out of reach, or simply pushed further down the priority list year after year. So no, this planet is not suddenly exploding beneath us. The numbers genuinely do not support that conclusion, as unsettling as this year has felt. So please don't be shocked if we see more major earthquakes before December arrives. I sincerely hope, if we do, that they strike offshore, away from major population centers, in locations that don't produce destructive tsunamis, so that we don't have to witness more images like the ones that came out of Venezuela this year. But even if we do see more of these events, even if the numbers keep climbing before the year ends, statistically speaking, it will still fall well within the normal range for what this planet does. A year can look and feel genuinely violent while still being, underneath all of it, statistically unremarkable in terms of raw earthquake frequency. But I do want to end on something that genuinely is unusual, something that doesn't fit neatly into these long-term averages, and that's the aftershock behavior we've been seeing lately, particularly out of Spain. We thought we had already seen the main event a few days ago with that magnitude 5, 2 that brought buildings down, and then it happened again. The aftershocks didn't taper off the way they normally would. They actually increased again. I'll leave the footage from today's shaking on your screen because it's honestly remarkable to watch unfold in real time. Stay safe out there, everyone. Keep an eye on your local emergency alerts. Keep a plan ready if you live in an active seismic zone, and I'll see you very soon in the next one. Bye-bye.